In this world, there exist different strata of life: the mineral, the plant, the animal, the man, the culture man, and the high culture. Unlike these other material entities, the high culture is a spiritual entity and is not subject to conventional perception. It's generally not something you can see with your eyes, except in exalted states of mystical awareness, or that has a conventional physical form, except as seen in dreams and vivid moments of imagination that are inspired. But just as we cannot see the wind, we can, however, see and hear the leaves blowing in the trees, or a curtain wafting by an open window, or feel it cascading across our skin. We can infer the existence of the wind, and similarly, we can infer the existence of the high culture. We know through intuitive observation and experience what belongs to a particular culture and what does not. The different forms of art, spirituality, science, philosophy, architecture, eroticism, style of war, style of techniques, education, society, law, style of imperialism, and so on, all have an internal cohesion that is usually more obvious to the cultural alien than to the members of the culture itself. For example, over the last 1,000 years of history, the Africans, Arabs, and Asians have seen the West as a cohesive unit known as the West. At the same time, Westerners were busy fighting intra-European wars, local kingdom against local kingdom. Westerners saw keen differences amongst themselves. The Celts are different from the Saxons, who are different from the Varangians, who are different from the Slavs, who are different from the Italians, who are different from the Franks, who are different from the Nords, who are different from the Picts, and so on. But to the cultural alien, they were all Westerners, and their cultural forms mentioned above were intuitively coherent and based on similar, if not the same, mentality, worldview, and inner experience of reality. It is only very recently that we, as Westerners, have begun to view ourselves as a single unit in this same light, and there is a reason for that. It's due to the natural life cycles and rhythms of the organism known as our high culture. Like any organic organism, it goes through stages of birth, development, peak, aging, and death, with all of their attendant attitude changes and goal reorientations. These attitude changes and goals, these historical missions that need to be fulfilled, are known as spirits of the ages. Each age that a high culture passes through has a certain spirit, a certain ethos or culture idea that urges us toward its fulfillment. In the current age, we have a very keen sense of history which allows for deep pattern recognition, resulting in cultural self-awareness. Hence why we are beginning to see ourselves as the collective West. Less and less do individual Western nations matter to us as sovereign political units, but our feeling of sovereignty in politics is expanding to encompass all Western nations. Our differences melt away, and our cultural and political unity takes center stage. Now, the ages of a high culture are generally as follows. First, an early feudalistic period characterized by religious feeling and strong social cohesion. This is followed by a period of critical spirituality, more individuality within religion, and some skepticism. And the absolute state known as democracy, characterized by rationalism and atheism, placing the economy as the most important aspect and activity of human life. Politics becomes softened and feminized and replaced with legalism, and the pursuit of individual happiness is placed above all else, creating the systems of capitalism and communism. This age is then followed by a period of the resurgence of authority and deep spirituality, characterized by penetrating universal wisdom and a keen sense of history and pattern recognition, and the correction of cultural errors. Think of a middle-aged man who reflects on his life and recognizes the mistakes of his youth and corrects them with discipline and finality. The pursuit of individual happiness is seen as immature and foolish, and activity becomes motivated instead by honor, duty, and a sense of historical and spiritual necessity. And finally, There is a period of universal Imperium, initiated by what we could call a type of Caesarism, and characterized by absolute politics, after which, death from old age. The high culture having fulfilled itself and spread its seed over the world like a great oak dropping its acorns, and then distributing the spiritually dense, nutrient-rich compost of its decayed corpse over the world, giving vitality and strength to whichever new young high culture is beginning its life, and takes into itself the rich spiritual fertilizer of the passed on high culture. As individual human beings, we are like the cells that make up the body of a high culture. It sends us impulses, inspiration, and impetus into us to think, act, and speak in certain ways at certain times. The high culture is our governing oversoul, and we are the ones who act in the material world to fulfill the historical mission of our high culture. A culture-bearing individual will attune him or herself to this oversoul and act in accord with it. These people become the great artists, philosophers, inventors, statesmen, warriors, spiritual leaders, and heroes of a culture who make the spirit of the age visible, palpable, tangible, manifest, and actionable to the rest of the human beings within the culture, letting them know which cultural, spiritual, technical, and political directions are healthy to move in that will fulfill the high culture's idea of itself, and which ideas and directions are distortions of the culture and are unhealthy and detrimental to the life of the high culture. Other culture-bearing individuals are the people who enjoy, appreciate, and promulgate the works and ideas of the great heroic personality types, and are just as important and attuned as they are. They simply did not enter into creative or heroic fields because it was either unnecessary for the culture idea to fulfill itself, or they have other cultural duties to fulfill, like raising a family, or living an appropriately healthy conventional life in support of the self-fulfillment of the high culture, according to the ideas made manifest by the works of the creative and heroic individuals. This macrocosmic idea is reflected in the microcosm of an individual. As we age and go through life, we are exposed to ideas that are either from within ourselves or from outside, both helpful and harmful, and we intuitively search within ourselves to regulate our ideas and behaviors so that we act in accordance with what is truthful and authentic for ourselves, to fulfill our idea of ourselves. At least this is what healthy, self-aware, culture-bearing individuals do. Others, who are not as self-aware, who are on autopilot, let's say, are susceptible to distorting ideas, and will act in ways that harm themselves and others, and work against the fulfillment of the culture idea, against the spirit of the age. The extent to which you are self-aware is the extent to which you are aware of the high culture. The extent to which you lack self-awareness is the extent to which you are susceptible to the seductive ideas of distorters, aliens, and people who are operating from the ideas of a previous outgrown spirit of a previous age, which is no longer beneficial, but becomes harmful if it overstays its welcome. Now, there are obviously two ways for a high culture to die, just like any other organism. Firstly, of old age after self-fulfillment. Or secondly, prematurely, due to illness, hostilities, or accident. After the first type of death, the corpse of the high culture is healthy and gives richness to the future of the world. After the second type of death, however, the remnants of the culture may possibly become pollutants and can cause malady and disease in a new high culture. For just like material organisms, the spiritual organism of the high culture can also suffer pathologies and diseases. But of course, these are spiritual pathologies, not physical ones. These pathologies are culture parasitism, culture retardation, and culture distortion. So culture parasitism is brought into the geographic and political territory of the high culture by the alien, a person who belongs to a completely different culture and does not assimilate into the high culture which they're living in. For each alien within the geographic territory of a high culture, a person from the high culture cannot be born. Culture parasitism is essentially a one-to-one displacement of the population. If 1 million Africans are living in the heart of Europe, that means 1 million Europeans cannot be born. This is not to say that you should hate the alien or feel any anger toward him, for absolute politics has no place for petty emotionality. It is a simple statement of fact that a foreign entity inside a host entity, which does not assimilate to the host, is, by its very nature, a parasite. This is not a derogatory statement, it's a simple truth. A person does not get angry at a tapeworm, they simply recognize it as a problem, which needs a solution, and they take steps toward the solution. There's no enmity, there's no animosity, there's no moralism here, it's just simple politics and self-preservation. Culture retardation manifests in an organism when old, outmoded ways of thinking and acting overstay their welcome, when the spirit of an old age remains in the hearts and minds of some senile people well into the new age, and clashes with the principles and ideas of the new spirit of the new age. Our Western culture suffers greatly from this. The 18th century ideas of democracy and liberalism have long overstayed their welcome, as the spirit of the age now is the resurgence of authority. And the idea of capitalism, invented by the British in the 19th century, has overstayed its welcome as well, preventing us from moving into a more ethical and useful form of economics. Liberalism, democracy, and capitalism were created by the age of rationalism, skepticism, and economic thinking, which served us well for a time, but they don't serve us anymore and are causing serious culture distortion, which costs the physical and spiritual lives and well-being of untold millions of Westerners. The individuals of the 20th century who were manifesting the spirit of the New Age, appropriately, trying to bring about the next natural development of the Western life cycles and rhythms, were ruthlessly thwarted, destroyed, and in death humiliated and ridiculed by the hate-filled, jealous, greedy, power-hungry, confused, and terrified culture parasites, culture retards, and culture distorters. Culture distortion comes from both parasitism and retardation. If parasitism and retardation are the causes of the disease, distortion is the disease itself. When a cultural alien lives within a high culture not its own, they may gain benefit from a certain spirit of a certain age of that high culture, and wish to make that mode of activity permanent, and prevent the development into a new spirit of a new age, so that they may continuously benefit forever at the expense of the people of that high culture. This is an acute form of parasitism taken to the next level, exploiting the weaknesses of culture retardation. Not only do they displace the high culture's population, but they actively exploit it for their own gain, taking the ideas and wishes of the culture retards and surreptitiously supporting them and enacting them as policy to artificially extend an old age past its expiration date. For example, the Jewish race had its own high culture that failed to fulfill its historical mission. It met an untimely end before it could die of old age. The Jewish culture was at its life cycle stage of the ascendance of economic thinking, i.e., capitalism, communism, rationalism, liberalism, etc. At the moment of its untimely collapse caused by external circumstances. And so this race is now permanently locked into this way of thinking and acting, to the extent that they do not assimilate into the new high culture in which they currently live. The remnants of a passed-on high culture tend to remain at the mode of activity they were in at the moment of its death. If they adopt the life cycles and rhythms of the new high culture in which they live and totally assimilate to it, they are no longer parasites. They are numbered amongst the high culture's population, and there's no problem. There's no displacement. There's no distortion. There's no issue. But to the extent that they love the economy and place the economy as the highest good and wealth acquisition as the purpose of life, they will use all of their will and resources to keep a high culture in its life cycle stage of economic thinking and rationalism, so that they may continually benefit therefrom. This includes, but is not limited to, the use of propaganda, the infiltration and corruption of academia, the alteration of the historical record, lobbying and infiltration of the government and its attendant think tanks, embedding themselves in the legal system to protect themselves from scrutiny, domination and debasement of the financial system, and the coercion, demoralization, and demonization of the race belonging to the high culture. A parasite such as this would not benefit from a resurgence of authority, which inherently eliminates the power of money. Authority places the economy at the bottom of the pyramid of society. The economy is simply a foundation for higher cultural activity, and serves no other goal than to allow the fulfillment of the high culture's historical mission. An authoritarian age is concerned with culture, self-defense, and spirituality, not wealth acquisition. Clearly, a capitalist or a communist or a rationalist or a liberal would not benefit from a resurgence of authority. In fact, they will actively oppose this resurgence in order to preserve their own wealth and political power, their own need for creature comforts and individual happiness, for they are indeed the natural enemies of authority, honor, and duty. Bankers, financiers, economists, liberals, and egalitarians tend to despise monarchs, autocrats, charismatic dictators, and aristocratic, culture-bearing personalities who would take away their power over the institutions and people of a society, and place them as servants of those institutions and people, or simply eliminate their mediocre ideologies wholesale, altogether, and demand that they act with honor, duty, spiritual awareness, and discipline. This is the most difficult and dangerous transition in a high culture's life cycles. The transition from rationalism to authority is fraught with the conflict between tradition and innovation, and the recognition of what a good, worthy tradition is versus an outmoded form of activity masquerading as tradition. Discernment is also needed for recognizing a good, worthy innovation from progressive rationalistic nonsense. For example, the American Constitution and similar European documents are products of the age of rationalism and liberalism, and serve almost no purpose today due to the fact that historical necessity and pattern recognition have disproven the dogmatic beliefs in equality, radical individualism, and democracy. These were simply the religious tenets of a temporary mode of activity, serving a particular purpose in our historical mission, which has already been fulfilled. Radical individualism, overstaying its welcome, has turned us into an ocean of atoms, who became homogenized, where people strive for sameness and mediocrity and social acceptance and shun excellence and uniqueness. Belief in equality and democracy has left us open to attack from culture parasites and culture distorters who do not share our sense of compassion or tolerance. It has also eliminated our ability to act heroically. For to be a hero means to stand out with excellence and uniqueness, and take a strong stance against an enemy. But in a democratic society, there is no enemy to defeat. There are only interest groups to outvote. And the one who controls the media and academia controls the minds of the voters. And they usually control these things through money and coercion. And to point this fact out does not make you a hero in today's world, but an intolerant bigot who doesn't understand love and acceptance. These so-called traditions of constitutionalism, democracy, and equality are not traditions at all, but anachronisms from an earlier time, which do not contain today's historical necessity of authority, of the will to power. If we do not claim and express the power, which our high culture is so desperately urging us to claim and express, we will succumb to the culture pathologies, and surely perish before our time. The question of which traditions should be preserved and which eliminated, and how the preserved traditions should be appropriately transformed to serve the new culture idea effectively in a new age with new circumstances, is one that can only be answered by the culture-bearing stratum of society, who are in tune with the impulses of the high culture. Recognizing these culture bearers and mantling them with absolute authority is the real trick. We must be careful of false messiahs, opportunists, and those who are weak, misguided, and impotent. We must learn to recognize the true culture bearers, who are driven by deep instinct and spirit. We must attune ourselves to the spiritual organism of our high culture, and discover through intuition and spiritual self-awareness the spirit of the age, and act in accordance with it, and in support of those who would manifest it in this world.